Hi everyone, this is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. Welcome to our discussion related to the Kingdom of Dal Riata. Now, if you have either Irish or Scottish ancestry, this is going to be particularly important to you. And so the Kingdom of Dal Riata is an ancient kingdom with, of course, a mysterious and obscure origin story. And so there's some confusion about where the Dal Riata kingdom came from. This was a conquering force that ultimately ended up in what are known as the Isles, so Scotland, Ireland. What's indicated, however, is that they came from the east again and settled in the west. What we found is that Dal Riata is connected to North Africa, East Africa, Eurasia, and Western Asia. And most specifically, in terms of biblical narratives, Dal Riata is related to or representative of Lot, Ishmael, and Esau. And so when looking at this collectively, you see this collective of entities that are under an umbrella in terms of the most recent common ancestor of Terah or Terah. And you also see this connection between these three entities in terms of them being what might be considered the firstborn, and so the original ones. The kingdom of Dal Riata, according to the narrative, was started by or headed by initially an entity known as Fergus More, and so that was the king of Dal Riata. There's also indication that the Stuart clan understood itself as being descended from the Dal Riata. And this is a depiction of James 5 over on the right hand side. You make note of the head covering that he is wearing in lieu of a crown. And from Library Ireland, you can see that there are a number of names associated with the Dal Riata kingdom, including those Mac names, McGee, McAllister, and also, of course, Ferguson, O'Hara. You have a number of names in the Hebrides that are associated with this Dal Riata kingdom and that Dal Riata ancestry. The question is, where is this Dal Riata ancestry coming from, and what is being indicated by this name, Dal Riata? So let's just quickly look at that. And as a quick reminder, there's also a narrative about there being an Egyptian presence in the Scotland, Ireland area, growing out of the migration of Queen Scotia out of Egypt into the Isles. And so what you also have with respect to Dal Riata is this transliteration situation where you can see a number of words that are essentially Riada. And so you can see Riada with an R-Y-A-D-H. You can see it with simply R-I-A-D-H, R-I-A-D-A, R-I-A-D, and then of course what's constantly preserved is the R-I-A. So we're going to quickly turn our attention to this root of Riad. And here you can see this construct of Riad is tied to Morocco. And it's related to a particular architectural style where you have a home with a courtyard and a garden that is in the middle of the home. And here again, you see Collins offering that this is a traditional Moroccan house with this interior garden sitting in the middle of the housing structure. And so you would typically see these in large homes or palaces. What you also see is that there's a particular type of tile that is also associated with this particular type of architecture. And so what you see here is this word, this construct of Riad. Riada is not only associated with the conquering kingdom from Europe, you also see Riada, of course, associated with Morocco. And now you see the tie between the kingdom of Dal Riata and the Riyadh in Morocco and what is known as the capital of Saudi Arabia. It's known as Riyadh. And so you see the empire and you see the main building for the capital. And looking at all of these connections between Europe and Africa and Asia, you see these common threads with respect to creating memorials to ancestors, whether you're talking about place names, whether you're talking about buildings, rivers, any geographic space, you might see this memorial to an ancestor, and this is no exception. And so we were just recently looking at Baka, and when you look across, you'll see that the original name for Baka was synonymous with Hagar, but it was spelled Hajar. And so that's an obscured name that's been replaced by Baka. So many people may not make that connection. And of course, you recall that Baka is very similar to Rebecca. And so you also have another situation going on here with respect to Hagar and Rebecca. You have Hagar representing Ishmael because Hagar was the mother of Ishmael, and Ishmael was the son of Abram or Abraham. And then on the left-hand side, you see this referencing to Rebecca. And Rebecca, of course, was the mother of Esau. And so collectively here you have these memorials to two males through memorials for their mothers. And here you can see variations in terms of this Dal Riata and Riada. And so you can see there was a battle of Riada in 1902. And then you can also see these various spellings of the kingdom of Dal Riata. And so it seems important to point out the fact that when you have this heavy presence of Riata in Europe, coming from Eurasia, coming from Western Asia, coming from North Africa, you essentially have Europa or Europe almost serving as a facade for what was actually going on. And so even though you have the Scots and you have the Irish, the roots of the Scots and the Irish appear to be east. And so even though they had a conquest dynamic in the west, their ancestry and history appears to be coming out of the east. And so you see that it is also connected to this area known as the Middle East, or what is known as Arabia now. You also see that it is tied to Esau and Ishmael. Now I also want to point out that Dal Riata is a tribute to Lot, because Dal is another word for lot or portion. And so you have these three entities all collectively being represented with the name Dal Riata and the history of Dal Riata, and also Riada and Riyadh. So it's tying together that North African presence, that East African presence, that Western Asian presence, and then of course you have all of this Eurasia migration, and then you have the Western Europe migration. And so it's important to point out with respect to this sort of facade with respect to the empire, that even though the colonization that has taken place around the world tends to point back to Europe, there's more to it than that, because you're basically looking at an empire of families. And these families come under that umbrella of Terah, because of course that is the most recent common ancestor of these entities. And so all of these conquest dynamics with respect to the indigenous people around the world, and those matriarchies also with these different indigenous groups. This is all relating back to this particular collective. And so it doesn't matter what the face looks like, whether they look white or black or Indian or in between. This is what is going on in terms of this collective. And of course, it's impossible to ignore the fact that what we are looking at with this confederacy is a collection of firstborns who, according to the biblical narrative, did not inherit as the firstborns, But you also see this process of sort of commandeering that firstborn identity, commandeering the firstborn blessing, commandeering the firstborn birthright, or taking it back or recouping it from whoever was identified as possessing it. And so in the instance of Ishmael, you have Isaac. In the instance of Esau, you have Jacob. In the instance of Lot, there's no other person indicated that sort of took the blessing from him. However, you have him very heavily involved in terms of this confederacy. Before we wrap up, there are a couple of things to make note of with respect to that most recent common ancestor, with respect to Lot, Esau, and Ishmael, and that person, of course, is Terah or Terah. Now, Strong's Concordance didn't really offer anything in terms of the meaning of this particular name, but in this publication you see some offering and some etymology, and it's indicated that the name means delay, wanderer, global spirit. Now that's very interesting considering the manifestations of this confederacy, this collective that has gone all around the world doing what it has done. But you also see some other indications down at the bottom with delay, turn, and wander. We're going to look at a couple of other indications with respect to this name. Now this etymology provides a little bit more detail coming out of Bible Gateway, and it offers 3 transliterations with respect to this Terah, Terah, and then what looks like Thara or Thera. And you see it means wild goat or turning, wandering. And so there is a close association with respect to this SHEM family group and this idea of a goat. You already know that that's what Esau was representing as a baby, appearing as a little baby goat. And then now you have this ancestor whose name, according to this narrative, means wild goat. Now I want to point out something as we are wrapping this up. There's an interesting narrative about when Columbus, or whatever his name was, came upon the Americas. And if you look at some of the older ancient books, there are these narratives about them believing that they found the lost tribes of Israel. This is noteworthy because the individuals who purportedly found these lost tribes of Israel were identifying themselves as being Jacob. However, what you don't hear in these narratives is this sort of reuniting with a long lost brother. What you have is a conquering of this long lost brother. And so, of course, this took place with the Moriscos and the Moranos. And so there's a question about why that took place and why this conquest dynamic took place all around the world, essentially. So you had this collective, Dal Riata, Riada, whatever it is that you want to call them. You had them going around the world conquering. So you had them come out of Europe and conquer in the Americas. You had them go out of Europe, conquer in Australia, India, Africa. They were all over the place. And the question is why? What was prompting all of this? What was prompting this fiction about finding and discovering all of these places? And what was going on that there was such a strong drive to overturn all of these indigenous cultures around the world? What was the common denominator that was driving all of this? What was the common denominator driving this desire for global domination? Remember, knowledge is power. Take care, Susan.